Vesna hadn't expected to outlast 12 warlords, 3 generals, and the most decorated battle commander in the kingdom's history. She certainly hadn't expected to do it while holding a stack of freshly rebound manuscripts and wearing ink stains on both sleeves. But here she was, the only person still vertical in the king's war room, surrounded by some of the most powerful men in the realm, all of whom were on the floor. It had happened without warning. One moment, the room had been full of low voices and the rustle of maps. The next, a pressure had slammed through the air like a wall of heat from an opened forge. Men twice her size buckled. Chairs scraped and toppled. General Macris, a man built like a siege tower, went down to one knee with a choked sound, both hands braced against the stone floor. The others followed, some gasping, some silent. All of them crumpling under a weight Vesna couldn't see or feel. She stood in the center of the chaos, blinking, her arms full of manuscripts, and thought very clearly, "Did I miss something?" The doors were still closed. No one had attacked. There was no smoke, no tremor in the stone, nothing to explain why a room full of battle-hardened wolves had just folded like paper in the rain. Then she saw the king. Jorvin Ashvane stood at the head of the long table, both hands pressed flat against the oak surface, his knuckles bone-white, his head bowed. The muscles in his forearms were rigid beneath rolled shirt sleeves, and a vein stood out along his temple like a fault line about to crack. He was shaking, not with weakness, with the effort of containment. Like a man trying to hold a door shut against a storm that wanted very badly to come inside. And he was staring directly at her. His eyes were wrong. That was the first thing she registered. Not the dark iron gray she'd glimpsed in passing from across courtyards and corridors, but something brighter, something that burned at the edges and pulsed with veins of amber in time, with an energy she could feel thrumming through the stone beneath her feet. They were not the eyes of a man. They were the eyes of something barely leashed. Vesna stood completely still. Manuscripts clutched to her chest like a shield, and did the only thing her overwhelmed mind could manage. She whispered to herself, as she often did when reality stopped cooperating, "This seems like a terrible place to be standing right now." The king's gaze sharpened on her. His lips parted. And for one horrifying second, she thought he was going to speak. Or worse, that whatever was churning behind those burning eyes was going to come pouring out. Instead, the pressure receded. It didn't vanish. It pulled back slowly, like a tide retreating from a shore it had nearly swallowed, and the men around her began to stir. Gasps, coughing, the scrape of boots on stone as they hauled themselves upright, shame and fear fighting for dominance across their faces. Nobody looked at the king. Nobody looked at each other. Vesna wanted very badly to set down the manuscripts and leave. But her feet had apparently decided, independently of her brain, that they were not going anywhere. She stood rooted as the room reformed itself around her and tried to understand why every person in the room had been driven to their knees except for her. A hand closed around her elbow from behind. She flinched hard and turned to find a tall man with cropped brown hair and an expression so carefully neutral it could have been carved from marble. She recognized him vaguely. Haddon, the king's beta and right hand. "Come with me, please," he said. His voice was calm, far too calm for what had just happened. He steered her through a side door and into a narrow corridor that smelled of cold stone and tallow. Vesna's heart was hammering now, the delayed panic arriving in full and spectacular force. "What was that?" she asked. Haddon didn't answer. He walked 3 paces ahead of her, his strides long and purposeful. "Did everyone just collapse?" she pressed. "Is the king ill? Should I fetch a healer? I'm a bookbinder. I don't know why I was even in that room. I was only delivering manuscripts for Master Odara because the usual courier has a stomach complaint, and nobody else wanted to climb 4 flights of stairs for a stack of books that probably nobody will even—" "Stop," Haddon said, and she stopped. Not because she wanted to, but because there was something in his voice that made her jaw click shut on reflex. He turned to face her. His eyes swept over her once, clinical and assessing, and landed on her face with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "You didn't feel anything," he said. It was not a question. Vesna opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Feel what?" she asked. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not surprise exactly, but something close to it. Something like the expression of a man who had stopped hoping a long time ago and then been proven wrong at the worst possible moment. "Stay in the castle," Haddon said. "Don't leave the grounds. I will send for you." "But why? Am I in trouble?" "I didn't do anything. I literally just stood there." "That," Haddon said quietly, "is precisely the problem." He left before she could respond. Vesna stood alone in the corridor, manuscripts still clutched against her chest, her pulse racing, and felt the first cold curl of genuine dread settle into her stomach. She didn't understand what had happened. She didn't understand why she had been the only one left standing. And she definitely did not understand why the king's beta had looked at her like she was either the answer to a prayer or the beginning of a very dangerous problem. That night, she dreamed of amber eyes watching her from the dark, of a pressure building against her ribs that felt like being held and crushed at the same time, of a voice, low and raw and cracking at the edges, saying her name like it was the only word left in a dying language. She woke with her sheets soaked in sweat, and a single thought lodged in her mind like a splinter she couldn't pull free. He was looking at me. Out of everyone in that room, he was looking at me. A knock came at her door before dawn. A guard stood in the dim corridor, his face blank and professional. "You've been summoned," he said. "The king's beta requests your presence, immediately." The antechamber where Haddon was waiting smelled like cold tea and decisions that had already been made without her. He stood by the narrow window with his hands clasped behind his back, the gray morning light sharpening the angles of his face into something that looked almost sympathetic, though Vesna suspected that was just the lighting. "Miss Vesna," he said, without turning, "thank you for coming." "I wasn't aware I had a choice," Vesna replied, and immediately regretted the edge in her voice. She was speaking to the beta of the realm. Bluntness was not a luxury available to bookbinders, but Haddon only turned and studied her with an expression she could not read. "You don't," he confirmed. "I have a request. Would you be willing to sit in a room with the king?" Vesna stared at him. "Sit in a room," she repeated. "That's all. No duties. No speaking unless spoken to. Simply sit." "Why?" The silence that followed was the kind of silence that answered questions by refusing to answer them. Haddon gestured toward the door, and she followed, because what else was she going to do? He led her through corridors she had never walked. The upper levels of the citadel, where the air tasted different, like polished wood and iron, and the faint metallic edge of something she couldn't name. It was quieter here. The bustle of servants and soldiers faded behind them, replaced by the kind of hush that only exists in places where power lives. They stopped at a heavy door banded with iron. Haddon pushed it open. The king's study was larger than the entire archive workshop where Vesna spent her days. Bookshelves lined 3 walls, though they were sparse, half-emptied, as if someone had cleared them in haste or in anger. A fire burned low in a stone hearth wide enough to stand in. Maps and reports were spread across a broad oak desk like the debris of a war still being fought on paper. And behind the desk, his head bent over a document, sat King Jorvin Ashvane. He did not look up when the door opened. He was writing, his hand moving in sharp, controlled strokes across a page, and the tension in his shoulders said that the act of writing required far more effort than it should. Vesna noticed the way his pen hesitated every few words, the way his jaw clenched and released in a steady, grinding rhythm, like a man chewing on pain he refused to spit out. "Here," Haddon murmured, guiding her to a chair against the far wall. Vesna sat. The wood creaked beneath her, startlingly loud in the silence. The king kept writing. She mouthed to Haddon, "Does he know I'm here?" The beta nodded once, his face giving away nothing, then positioned himself by the door like a stone carving that happened to breathe. Minutes crawled past. She pressed her palms flat against her thighs and tried to make herself small. Tried to do what she had spent her entire life perfecting. Being invisible. Being the kind of person rooms forgot about. 2 advisors entered. They spoke in low, careful tones about border disputes and grain levies, and the king listened without looking up, asking questions in a voice that was lower and rougher than she'd expected. Each time he spoke, Vesna felt something behind her ribs catch, a small snag, like thread pulled against a nail. She couldn't have explained why. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The advisors argued about taxation rights on river commerce. The king made a note in the margin of a report. Then his pen paused. Vesna watched his hand, watched the slight tremor run through his fingers, a vibration that traveled up his wrist and into his forearm like something trying to rattle its way out. She saw his knuckles whiten around the pen, saw the muscle jump along his jaw. "Not now," she heard him mutter, so quietly she wasn't sure anyone else had caught it. The tremor built. She felt a faint ripple in the air, a pressure that pressed against her eardrums like the moment before thunder. Then it stopped. Just stopped. Like a wave that had reared up and then thought better of crashing. His hand steadied. His breathing evened. He resumed writing, and the advisors continued their debate as though nothing at all had happened. But Haddon noticed. Vesna saw the beta's gaze snap to the king, then to her, then back to the king. She saw the shift in his posture, the barely perceptible easing of tension along his shoulders. The look on his face was one of cautious, almost painful relief. Like a man who had been bracing for a blow every single day and had just, for the first time, watched it fail to land. 20 more minutes passed, then an hour. No surge, no collapse. The tremors came and went in small waves, but nothing like the devastating force from the war room. Something about her presence was holding it back. When the advisors left, Haddon crossed to the king's desk. They spoke in voices too low for Vesna to hear. She caught fragments. Stable. Duration. Unprecedented. Then the king's gaze lifted. It swept the room, found her, and held. The weight of his attention was a physical thing. Not the crushing force from the war room, nothing that hurt or drove her down, but undeniable all the same. Like standing in a shaft of sunlight so concentrated it turned the air thick. She looked back because she didn't know what else to do. He looked exhausted. The hollows beneath his eyes were deep enough to hold shadows. He was striking in the way that cliffs were striking. Something immense being worn down by forces too vast to fight. That went well, Vesna muttered under her breath, and then froze, because she realized she had said it out loud. The king's eyebrow twitched. He looked at Haddon. Haddon looked at the ceiling. "You may go," the beta said, guiding her toward the door with a hand that was almost gentle. She made it halfway down the corridor before his footsteps caught up. "Same arrangement," Haddon said. "Every morning, every afternoon council session, every evening." Vesna turned to face him, her stomach sinking. "Every? You mean every day?" "Until further notice." "But I have work. The archives. Master Odara needs me to finish rebinding the Thessaly Codex by the end of the month. I have 17 repair orders piled on my workbench, and the Eastern Collection has silverfish damage that—" "Those have been reassigned," Haddon said. Vesna's mouth opened. Closed. The corridor felt suddenly narrow, the walls pressing in. "Miss Vesna," Haddon said, and his voice softened by exactly 1 degree, which from him felt almost gentle. "The king's condition is not common knowledge. What you witnessed yesterday, what you experience today, it stays between us. Is that understood?" "I understand," she whispered. Haddon studied her for a moment, then nodded. "One more thing," he said. "The king has requested a private audience with you. This evening. His personal chambers. Sunset. Vesna's heart hit the stone floor beneath her feet. His personal what? She managed. But Haddon was already walking away, his boots echoing off the walls and leaving her standing alone with a mouth full of questions and a stomach full of dread. Vesna went straight to Odara. The head archivist was exactly where she always was, seated at the great work table in the archive's lower level, surrounded by towers of manuscripts and the warm smell of old paper. Odara was 73 years old and sharp as a blade. She had found Vesna as an infant, abandoned between two shelves with no name and no note, and had raised her as her own. She was the closest thing to a mother Vesna had ever known. "Sit down," Odara said without looking up from the manuscript she was examining. "You look like you've swallowed a hornet." "I need to tell you something," Vesna said, closing the door behind her. "About the king." Odara's pen stopped. She looked up, her dark eyes sharp beneath heavy brows. Vesna told her everything. The war room surge, standing alone while everyone crumpled, the experiment in the king's study, the way the tremors stalled in her presence. When she finished, Odara was quiet for a long time. "I was wondering when someone would come to me about this," the old woman said at last. Vesna blinked. "You knew?" "I know things, child. I've worked in this citadel for 51 years. The king's private meetings have been getting shorter, his public appearances fewer. The court healers have been ordering herbs in quantities that suggest something far worse than battle fatigue." Odara set her pen down. "The king is dying, Vesna." The word dropped between them like a stone into still water. "Dying," Vesna repeated, and her voice sounded hollow, even to herself. "His power is consuming him," Odara continued. "It has been growing since the siege at Kareth Pass. Something happened there, and very few people alive know what. But the force inside him is more than one body should hold. Every surge strips something away that doesn't come back." She paused. "The court healers give him 6 months. Perhaps less." Vesna's chest constricted. But today, in his study, it didn't happen. He had tremors, but the surge never broke through. "Because you were there," Odara said. Simply, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Vesna shook her head. "That doesn't make sense. I'm a bookbinder. I mend old spines and press damaged pages. I'm nobody." "You are not nobody." Odara's voice cut like a blade drawn across parchment. "You have never been nobody, no matter how many years you have spent trying to convince yourself otherwise." She held Vesna's gaze until Vesna looked away. "I don't understand why I'm different," Vesna whispered. "Neither do I," Odara admitted. "But the fact remains. You stood when everyone else fell. And that boy on the throne, that exhausted, crumbling boy who has been holding himself together with nothing but stubbornness and pride," he noticed. Vesna didn't correct her for calling the Alpha King a boy. Odara would call the gods themselves children if she thought they were being foolish. "What do I do?" Vesna asked. "You do what you have always done. You show up. You stay steady. You keep your eyes open." Odara paused, and something in her expression shifted, growing softer and sadder at the same time. "And Vesna, guard your heart. Carefully. Kings break things without meaning to, and women like us rarely survive the aftermath." Vesna let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "That won't be a problem." Odara gave her a look that suggested she was not remotely convinced. That evening, a guard led Vesna to the king's private chambers. The castle grew quieter with each flight of stairs until the only sound was the guttering of wall torches. The guard knocked once at a set of carved doors and stepped aside. "Enter," came the king's voice from within, and the sound of it sent something flickering through Vesna's stomach that she immediately stamped down. The chambers were enormous. Stone walls draped with old tapestries, a broad hearth with a fire burning low, and dominating the room, a bed so massive it could have comfortably slept 4 people, and still left room for regret. Jorvin stood by the window, his back to her, silhouetted against the last bruised light of dusk. He had changed into a loose shirt, and without the armor of tailored wool, he looked broader and somehow more dangerous. "I won't keep you long," he said, still facing the window. "Haddon tells me the arrangement is showing results." "If by results you mean nothing exploded and nobody passed out, then yes," Vesna murmured. She had meant it only for herself. But the room was quiet and sound carried. Jorvin turned and something moved behind his eyes. Not amusement. Closer to surprise, like he had forgotten people could speak to him without deference. "You will be provided a chair," he said, his tone measured and formal. "And a work table. Here, in this room. I work late most evenings. Your presence seems to—" He paused, searching. "Stabilize things." Vesna glanced at the far wall. A chair had already been placed there, beside a small table with a lit candle and a stack of old books. Cracked spines, foxed pages, the kind of books that needed someone who cared about them. "You left these for me," she said before she could stop herself. The king's jaw tightened. Those were already there. They were not. The dust patterns made that obvious. But Vesna pressed her lips together against the smile threatening to escape and said nothing. She sat. He returned to his desk, and the evening stretched out between them, filled with the scratch of his pen, the pop of embers, and a silence that should have been uncomfortable, but somehow was not. Vesna opened one of the books, a history of the eastern provinces, old and beautifully lettered, with marginal annotations in a hand she did not recognize. She ran her fingers along the damaged spine, assessing the deterioration out of pure instinct, and began to read. At some point she realized the scratching of his pen had stopped. She glanced up. Jorvin was watching her. His pen rested motionless on the page, and his expression was caught between something guarded and something almost soft. The firelight threw warm copper across the sharp angles of his face, and she noticed for the first time how young he looked beneath the exhaustion. How human. "The binding on this one is cracked through," she said, holding up the book. "The front board is barely attached. I can fix it, if you would like." He blinked, as though the offer had caught him off guard. "You don't have to do that." "I want to. It's what I do." A pause settled between them. Then, quietly, "Thank you." It was the first time he had spoken to her like she was a person and not a piece of medical equipment. Vesna nodded, tucked the book against her lap, and pretended that the warmth expanding beneath her ribs was absolutely nothing to worry about. She returned every evening after that. A rhythm formed, fragile and strange. She sat in her chair with her borrowed books and her mending tools while the king worked at his desk, and neither of them acknowledged the absurdity of it. The Alpha King and the bookbinder, spending their nights in silence like two people who had somehow always known each other. His tremors came and went. She learned their language, the stiffening of his shoulders before a wave, the way his pen would hover as if the words had fled. Each time the tremor crested and broke apart, smaller than the last. She never mentioned it. He never acknowledged it. But on the third evening she found a new candle on her table. Beeswax. Expensive. "You left me another candle," she said. "I did not," the king replied, without looking up. On the fourth evening there was a cushion on her chair. Deep green, embroidered at the edges. "This cushion is new," Vesna observed. "It has always been there," said the king. On the fifth evening, she arrived to find a pot of tea steeping on her table, still hot, with a cup set beside it and a small dish of honey. Vesna looked at the tea, looked at the king. He was bent over his reports, radiating an intensity of concentration that was, she suspected, entirely fabricated. "Your Majesty," she said. He replied, not looking up. "The tea." "What tea?" Vesna bit the inside of her cheek hard and poured herself a cup. She was halfway through her second cup when his voice cut through the quiet. Do you always talk to yourself? He asked. Still not looking up, Vesna froze. I don't talk to myself. You have been narrating your opinions about that book under your breath for 20 minutes, he said. You called the author a pompous goat with a gift for saying nothing beautifully. Vesna wanted the floor to open up and swallow her. I didn't realize you could hear me. I can hear everything in this room. Everything? Everything. Vesna set down her teacup with great care and made a solemn internal vow to never speak again. The vow lasted approximately 4 minutes before she muttered something scathing about a misattributed footnote, and the king exhaled through his nose in a way that sounded suspiciously and unmistakably like a suppressed laugh. Something cracked open in her chest at that sound. Something warm and dangerous that she immediately tried to wall back up. On the 7th evening, his tremors were worse. She noticed the moment she stepped through the door. The fire was too high, the room too warm, the air heavy with a pressure that hummed against her skin like the charged stillness before a thunderstorm. Jorvin sat at his desk with his hands pressed flat against the surface, his breathing controlled and deliberate in the way of a man fighting something with every scrap of discipline he possessed. Vesna sat in her chair, opened her book, and read. The pressure eased. Slowly, degree by degree, like a fist unclenching finger by finger. His breathing steadied. The tremor in his hands stilled. The charged weight in the air thinned and dissipated until the room felt like a room again, not a held breath. But this time, as the tension bled away, Vesna felt something she had never felt before. A pull. Deep and low and undeniable, like a thread connected to the center of her chest had been drawn taut without her knowing, and now it was tugging, gently but insistently, toward him. She closed the book, looked up. The king was looking at her, and there was something in his face she had not seen before. Something raw and questioning and afraid, like he was standing at the edge of something he did not want to name. What is that? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know. She lied. Because she did know. She felt it in her bones, in the way her wolf, silent her entire life, had just lifted its head and turned toward him with an attention so absolute it felt like a commandment. She was not ready to say it out loud. Not yet. The chair moved closer. It happened in increments so small that Vesna almost convinced herself she was imagining it. On the 8th evening, it sat 2 feet nearer to his desk than it had the night before. On the 9th, another foot. By the 11th evening, she was close enough to hear the scratch of his pen without straining and to catch the faint scent of him beneath the smoke and ink. Warm and deep and sharp, like standing downwind of a winter fire. She did not mention it. He did not acknowledge it. The distance between them was disappearing, and so was her ability to pretend it didn't matter. The tremors had been manageable for the first week and a half. Small surges that built and faded like waves against a seawall, each one weaker than the last. But on the 12th evening, something shifted. Vesna felt it the moment she entered the room, a thickness in the air, a pressure against her temples that was sharper and more urgent than anything she had felt before. Jorvin was standing by the window, his back rigid, his hands gripping the stone ledge so hard she could see the tendons standing out beneath his skin. Your Majesty? She said carefully. He didn't turn. Sit down, he said through his teeth. She sat, opened her book, tried to read. The pressure didn't ease. It built, slow and relentless, and she could hear his breathing changing, growing ragged and strained. His shoulders were shaking. A low sound escaped him, something between a growl and a gasp, and the air in the room seemed to vibrate with a force she could feel behind her eyes. The candle flame on her table bent sideways. The fire in the hearth roared higher, throwing wild shadows against the walls. Vesna stood without thinking. She crossed the room in 4 strides and did something she had never done before. She reached out and placed her hand on his. The contact was electric. His skin was burning, literally hot to the touch, and the force pouring off him hit her palm like a gust of scorching wind. But she held on. She felt her fingers tighten around his wrist, felt the bones beneath his skin, felt the impossible hammering of his pulse, and the surge broke. Not slowly this time, not a gradual retreat. It shattered, collapsing inward like a wave that had been caught mid-crest and simply ceased to exist. The pressure vanished. The fire dropped. The room went utterly still. Jorvin's hand turned beneath hers and his fingers locked around her wrist. Not gentle. Desperate, like a drowning man finding something solid in dark water. He was breathing hard, his head still bowed, and she could feel the tremors running through him, aftershocks of something that had almost torn free. "Don't let go," he said, and his voice was wrecked. "Not yet." Vesna didn't let go. She stood beside him at the window, her hand locked in his, and watched the moon rise over the citadel walls while the king of the realm shook like a man pulled back from the edge of a cliff. After that night, the chair disappeared entirely. A second seat was placed beside his desk, close enough that their elbows nearly touched while he worked. Nobody discussed why. Nobody needed to. The arrangement had escalated past the point where distance was an option, and both of them knew it. Contact became part of the routine. When the tremors built, she placed her hand on his forearm and the wave would stall and collapse. When the pressure in the room started to thicken, she moved her chair closer until her knee pressed against his beneath the desk, and the air would clear. It was clinical, necessary, medicinal. At least, that is what she told herself every night when she lay alone in her narrow bed in the servants' quarters and pressed her hands against her burning face. Because the truth was that every time she touched him, the pull between them grew fiercer. Every time his hand found hers in the dark, something inside her shifted toward him with a certainty that terrified her. And her wolf, silent for 22 years, was now wide awake and pacing. One night, she fell asleep in her chair. She hadn't meant to. The hour was late, the fire was low, and his presence had become so familiar that it no longer kept her on edge. Instead, it did something worse. It made her feel safe. She woke to warmth. A blanket had been draped over her, heavy wool, the kind reserved for the king's own quarters. The fire had been stoked back to full strength. And Jorvin was asleep at his desk, his head resting on his folded arms, his face turned toward her. He looked peaceful, truly peaceful, in a way she had never seen while he was awake. The hard lines of his face had softened, and his breathing was deep and even and steady. He looked younger. He looked like someone who had finally, after a very long time, stopped fighting. Vesna watched him for a long moment, something aching and complicated moving through her chest. Before she could stop herself, she reached out and brushed a strand of dark hair from his forehead. The moment her fingers touched his skin, the world cracked open. It lasted less than a second. A flash, bright and violent behind her eyes, of a landscape she had never seen. Vast and frozen. A plain of black ice stretching in every direction beneath a sky that pulsed with sickly amber light. And in the center, something moved. Something looked at her. Something with eyes like burning coal that radiated an intelligence so cold and patient it stopped her breath. Vesna snatched her hand back. Her heart was slamming against her ribs. Jorvin stirred, his breathing hitched, but he didn't wake. Vesna stared at him, her hand trembling in her lap, and felt the first real thread of terror weave itself into the fabric of everything she thought she understood. Because whatever was wrong with the king, it was not just power spiraling out of control. There was something alive inside him. And it had seen her. The surges got worse. Over the next 3 days, the intervals between episodes shortened and the intensity climbed. Where once the tremors came every few hours, they now came every 40 minutes. Where once her touch dissolved them like mist, she now had to hold on longer, press harder, stay closer. It was working, but barely, like bailing water from a boat with a crack that kept widening. The court healers were alarmed. Vesna heard fragments through closed doors. Accelerating. Unprecedented rate of decline. We may have weeks, not months. She pressed her back against the corridor wall and tried to breathe through the weight crushing her chest. On the fourth morning, it happened. Jorvin was in the council chamber, surrounded by advisors and military commanders. Vesna sat in her usual chair against the wall, close enough to intervene if a tremor built, far enough to maintain the threadbare fiction that she was merely a court attendant. The discussion concerned troop movements along the western border. Jorvin was speaking, his voice low and controlled, when his words simply stopped. Mid-sentence, like someone had reached inside him and pulled a lever. Vesna saw it happen in his eyes first. The iron gray bled away, replaced by that terrible pulsing amber. The muscles in his neck corded tight. His hands, flat on the table, began to shake, and the oak surface beneath them groaned and splintered as though an invisible weight was being driven down through his palms. The pressure hit the room like a wall. Men collapsed, chairs overturned. Commander Aldrich, the largest man in the room, dropped to both knees with a sound like a wounded animal. The air itself seemed to compress and distort, bending the candlelight into strange angles. Vesna was already moving. She crossed the room in 5 strides, seized the king by both arms and held on with everything she had. The world tore apart. One moment she was standing in the council chamber, her fingers digging into the fabric of his sleeves. The next, she was somewhere else. Entirely. Cold. That was the first thing. A cold so absolute it felt less like temperature and more like the absence of anything warm that had ever existed. Vesna stood on a plain of black ice that stretched in every direction beneath a sky choked with amber light. The silence was total, suffocating, a dead stillness that belonged to places where sound itself had been forbidden. "Jorvin," she called out, and her voice fell flat against the ice like a stone dropped into mud. She found him 30 paces ahead, on his knees before a massive structure of frozen crystal that rose from the ice like a cathedral made of grief. It was a cage. The walls were translucent, thick as castle stone but clear as glass, and inside she could see 2 shapes. Wolves. One was enormous, silver-white, its body curled protectively around itself. Its chest rose and fell in shallow, labored breaths, and patches of its fur had gone dark and brittle, like frost-burned leaves. It was dying. She knew it the way she knew her own heartbeat. This was Jorvin's wolf. This was him. The other was wrong. It was larger than the first and darker than anything she had ever seen, a shadow given muscle and teeth and terrible purpose. Its fur absorbed light rather than reflecting it, and its eyes, those awful amber eyes, burned with a hunger that had nothing to do with appetite and everything to do with consumption. It was wrapped around Jorvin's wolf like a parasite, its body pressed against the silver one, and where their fur touched, the silver was turning black. It was eating him, absorbing him, swallowing him inch by inch from the inside out. Vesna slammed her palms against the ice cage. "Stop! Get away from him!" The dark wolf's head lifted. It turned to face her with a slowness that spoke of absolute confidence, absolute patience, and it smiled. Not a snarl, not a threat display, a smile, with too many teeth and too much intelligence behind eyes that had been waiting for her. Vesna screamed. She hit the council chamber floor with a crack that she felt in her teeth. The ceiling swam above her, candlelight and stone spinning in lazy circles. Hands were lifting her. Haddon's face appeared, tight with controlled panic. "What happened?" the beta demanded. Vesna's mouth moved, but the words wouldn't come. She could still feel the cold, could still see those amber eyes, could still feel the patient, calculating hunger behind them. "The king," she managed. "He's unconscious but stable," Haddon said. "What did you see?" Vesna looked at the beta and made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff. She told him some of it. The ice. The two wolves. The one consuming the other. But she did not tell him about the smile. She did not tell him that the thing inside the king wasn't just a disease or a curse or a complication from the war. It was awake. It was intelligent. And now it knew exactly who she was. That night, alone in her narrow bed in the servants' quarters, Vesna lay staring at the ceiling and trying to convince her body to stop shaking. Then she heard it. A whisper. Low and intimate and impossibly close, like lips pressed against her ear. A single word in a voice she had never heard before, a voice that sounded like cracking ice and smoldering ash and the slow, patient turning of something ancient. Her name. Vesna. She sat up in the dark, her heart pounding, her hands fisted in the sheets. The room was empty. The corridor outside was silent. Nothing moved. But the whisper lingered in the air like smoke. And she knew, with a certainty that settled into her bones like winter, that the thing inside Jorvin had just reached out and touched her mind. The whisper did not stop. It came at odd hours, slipping in during moments when her guard was down, while she was mending a book and her thoughts drifted, while she was walking the corridors and passed through a shaft of cold air, while she sat beside Jorvin in the evening and his hand found hers in the dark. Always the same voice, that patient, frost-edged murmur, and always the same message dressed in different words. You are not enough. Not in those exact words. It was subtler than that. It came as a thought she mistook for her own, a quiet observation that felt native to her mind rather than planted there. He was getting worse even with her beside him. The surges were breaking through faster. The healers were frightened. Her presence was no longer stabilizing him. It was merely slowing the collapse. Bandage, not cure. The phrase lodged in her thoughts and would not leave. On the third morning after the council chamber incident, she overheard the court healers conferring outside the king's study. She had not meant to eavesdrop. She had been coming around the corner with a stack of repaired books, and their voices had carried through the half-open door. The suppressive effect is weakening, one of them said. The episodes are more frequent than they were a week ago, even with the girl present. Is it possible her proximity is creating a dependency? Asked another. That his power is adapting to her presence and compensating? We need to consider alternatives. If this trajectory continues, the king has weeks. Vesna leaned against the corridor wall and closed her eyes. The whisper curled through her mind, quiet and certain. You are making it worse. She tried to push it away. Tried to hear Odara's voice instead. Steady and fierce. You are not nobody. But Odara's words felt distant and thin, while the whisper felt close and real and true, in a way that resonated with the oldest, deepest wound she carried. She had been left in the archives as an infant. No name, no note, no reason given and none needed, because what kind of person leaves a child among dusty shelves and walks away? The kind of person who looked at that child and saw nothing worth keeping. She had spent 22 years learning to take up as little space as possible, to be useful without being visible, to earn her presence in every room she entered because she had never once believed she had a right to be in any of them. And now she was being told, by the healers, by the evidence, by the voice that whispered in the dark, that her presence wasn't saving the king. It was prolonging his suffering, that she was standing in the space where a real solution should be. That evening, she sat beside Jorvin while he worked. His hand rested on hers atop the desk, warm and solid, and the surges stayed quiet. He had been speaking more in recent days. Small things. A dry comment about a minister's incompetence. A question about the book she was reading. Once, he had looked at her with an expression so unguarded, so nakedly grateful, that she had to turn away before her eyes betrayed her. She watched him now in the firelight, the way exhaustion and focus fought for control of his face, the way his thumb moved absently across her knuckles while he read, and she felt her heart break along a fault line she had been pretending didn't exist. I love you, she thought. And because I love you, I have to leave. Because if she stayed, he would keep leaning on her while the thing inside him grew stronger and his healers grew more desperate. He would keep holding her hand while his wolf was consumed, and he would die beside her, grateful and gentle, and still believing that her presence was helping when it wasn't. Not anymore. She waited until he fell asleep. It didn't take long. His head dipped forward, then settled against his arms, and his breathing deepened into the rhythm she knew so well. She sat beside him for a long time, watching the firelight play across his face, memorizing the details she was about to lose. The way his lashes fanned against his cheekbones, the scar above his left eyebrow that she had never asked about, the faint crease between his brows that smoothed away only in sleep. She slipped her hand free from beneath his. Carefully, slowly. His fingers twitched but did not close. Vesna stood. She did not leave a note. She did not touch his face or whisper a goodbye, or do any of the things she wanted to do so badly that the wanting felt like a fist inside her chest. She simply turned and walked to the door. The corridor outside was dark and silent. She walked through it without looking back, her footsteps soft against the stone, her arms wrapped around herself against a cold that had nothing to do with temperature. She passed the archive on the way down, paused for one breath outside the door where Odara would be sleeping in the back room, pressed her palm flat against the wood, then kept walking. The main gate was lightly guarded at this hour. The watchman barely glanced at her as she passed. Nobody stopped a servant leaving before dawn. Nobody noticed. Nobody ever noticed her. That was the point. That had always been the point. Vesna stepped through the gate and into the open dark beyond the citadel walls. The night air hit her face, cold and sharp, and smelling of pine and distance, and she started walking. Behind her, deep inside the castle, in the chambers where the king slept peacefully for the first time in over a year, something stirred. Not the man, not his wolf. The other thing. The thing with amber eyes and too many teeth and a patience measured in centuries. It smiled in the dark, because the only person standing between it and the king had just walked out the door. Jorvin woke with his cheek pressed against the oak desk and the room silent around him. He knew before he opened his eyes. The absence hit him like a physical blow, a hollow in the air where her warmth, and her scent, and the steady rhythm of her breathing should have been. He reached toward the chair beside his desk and his hand found nothing. The space where she sat every evening was empty. He sat up. The fire had burned to ash. The chair beside his desk was empty. Her mending tools still sat on the table, exactly where she had left them. The book she had been reading, the insufferable trade history she had been quietly eviscerating under her breath for 3 days, lay closed on the arm of the chair. She had left it open the night before. She was gone. The surge that followed was not like the others. The others had been the enemy pressing outward, testing the walls of his control. This one came from him. From the wolf. From the man. From every part of himself that had spent the last 3 weeks learning what it felt like to not be alone and was now being asked to survive the removal of that knowledge. The force blew the study doors off their hinges. The sound cracked through the upper corridors like thunder and sent guards stumbling back against the walls, hands over their ears, knees buckling. The stone floor split in a jagged line that ran from his chambers to the stairwell. Every candle in the east wing guttered and died. Haddon found him in the corridor, half-dressed, his eyes blazing amber, his hands shaking so badly he couldn't grip the doorframe he was using to hold himself upright. "Where is she?" Jorvin's voice was barely recognizable. It came out layered, the man and the wolf speaking at once, harmonic and terrible. "I don't know," Haddon said, and he had the decency not to lie. "I'll find her." "By sunrise," Jorvin said, and the words were an order and a plea and a threat, all compressed into 2 syllables. Riders went out before the sky began to lighten. Every gate guard was questioned. Every road leading from the citadel was searched. Jorvin wanted to go himself, and it took Haddon and 3 guards to convince him that the king riding out in his current state would flatten every village between the castle and the tree line. The surges came every 15 minutes, walls cracked, windows shattered. The court evacuated the east wing entirely. A day passed. Then 2. Jorvin stopped eating, stopped sleeping. The amber in his eyes became permanent. Odara, who feared very little and respected even less, stood in the doorway of his study and told him flatly that if he didn't sit down and drink water, she would make him, king or not. He sat. He drank. He stared at the empty chair beside his desk and said nothing. On the second evening, Haddon found Vesna. She was in a woodcutter's shelter 3 leagues east of the citadel walls, curled on the dirt floor, too weak to stand. The bond had been tearing at her since she left, migraines first, then tremors, then a hollowing ache in her chest that made every breath feel like breathing through broken glass. Her wolf, so recently awakened, was howling inside her with a grief so raw it had driven her to her knees within hours of leaving. Haddon knelt beside her and held a canteen to her lips. She drank, coughing, her hands shaking too badly to hold it herself. "He's destroying the castle," Haddon said simply. "Good," Vesna whispered. "Let someone better calm him down." The beta was quiet for a moment. Then he sat back on his heels and looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his carefully controlled face. Something close to anger. Something close to grief. "There is no one better," he said. "There is no one else. There never was. The healers said my effect was weakening. They said he was getting worse." "He was getting worse because the thing inside him was growing," Haddon replied. "Not because of you. Because of Drevnik." The name landed like a stone. Vesna stared at him. "Who?" Haddon told her. He told her about Kareth Pass, about the siege that ended a war and broke the king who won it. About the enemy Alpha, Drevnik, a man who had once been reasonable, who had once sat across a negotiation table and spoken of peace, before pride and paranoia on both sides had turned diplomacy into bloodshed. He told her about the single combat. Jorvin had challenged Drevnik to end the siege without more civilian casualties. He had won. But as Drevnik died, pinned and bleeding and aware that his pack was lost, he had done something that no Alpha had done in living memory. He had forced the entirety of his power through the death bite. A deliberate act of war fought with the last weapon he had, his own dying essence, poured into the man who had killed him. Drevnik's consciousness survived inside Jorvin, Haddon said. His power, his will, his hatred, all of it. It's been growing ever since, feeding on Jorvin's guilt, using it as fuel. The king blames himself for every life lost at Kareth Pass, for every alternative he didn't pursue, for every person who died because he chose the sword instead of the table. Haddon paused. And Drevnik feeds on that guilt the way fire feeds on dry wood. Vesna pressed her fists against her eyes. "The whisper," she said, her voice cracking. "In my head, telling me I wasn't enough." "It was him," Haddon confirmed. "Drevnik wanted you gone. You were the only thing standing between him and complete control." The realization hit her like cold water to the face. She hadn't left because she was brave. She hadn't left because she was selfless. She had left because the thing destroying Jorvin from the inside had reached into her mind and pressed on the oldest, deepest wound she carried, and she had believed it without question. Because it was easy to believe. Because she had been believing it her whole life. Vesna pressed her palms flat against the dirt floor and pushed herself upright. "Take me back," she said. Haddon studied her. "You understand what you're walking into." "Take me back," she repeated. "Now." The citadel was a ruin of fractured stone and fear. Vesna felt the damage before she saw it. The pressure in the air hit her half a league out. a low vibration that buzzed in her teeth and trembled in the ground beneath the horse's hooves. By the time they reached the main gate, the guards were standing at a distance, their faces drawn, unable to approach the entrance without being driven to their knees. Vesna dismounted and walked through the gate alone. Inside, the corridors were empty. Cracks ran through the walls like black veins. Torches had been knocked from their brackets. The air was thick and electric and wrong, saturated with a force that pressed against her skin from every direction. She felt none of it. She climbed the stairs to his chambers. Each step brought the pressure higher, denser, until the air itself seemed to hum with barely contained violence. By the third flight she could hear him. Not words. A sound. Low and continuous and agonized. The sound of a man and a wolf fighting for survival in the same body and losing. The door to his chambers was gone. Blown from its frame. Vesna stepped through. Jorvin was on the floor in the center of the room, on his hands and knees, his body flickering between forms. His hands were claws, then fingers, then claws again. His spine arched and twisted. The amber in his eyes was so bright it cast light across the stone floor like a lantern, and the sound coming from his throat was continuous, a growl and a scream and a sob woven together into something that was barely human. "Jorvin," she said. His head snapped toward her. The amber flared. For one terrible second she didn't recognize anything behind those eyes. Then something shifted. A flicker. A spark of iron gray fighting through the burning amber like a single star through storm clouds. "Vesna," he said, and her name came out broken and desperate and relieved, and it was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. She crossed the room and dropped to her knees in front of him. His body was radiating heat, his skin slick with sweat, the muscles in his arms trembling with the effort of holding himself together. She took his face in both hands. "I'm here," she said. "I'm not leaving." "You have to go," he managed, the words grinding out between clenched teeth. "I can't hold." "Then stop holding," Vesna said. "Let me in." She pressed her forehead against his. The fracture swallowed her whole. The ice was gone. What had been a frozen plain was now a wasteland of shattered crystal scattered across black ground pulsing with amber veins. At the center of everything, Drevnik waited. He was enormous now. The dark wolf filled the space like a shadow given weight, his amber eyes blazing with triumph. And beneath one massive paw, pinned and barely breathing, lay the last remnant of Jorvin's wolf. A small shape of tarnished silver, its eyes half closed. "You came back," Drevnik said. His voice was the cracking of ice and the grinding of stone, and it resonated inside her skull. "I'm impressed. And disappointed. I had hoped you'd stay gone." Vesna stood before the dark wolf and felt every instinct in her body scream at her to run. "You whispered to me," she said. "You made me think I was the problem." "I told you the truth," Drevnik replied, and his smile was patient and horrible. "You are not enough. You never were. A nameless foundling abandoned in a pile of books because even her own parents couldn't find a reason to stay." The words landed exactly where they were meant to land, deep and precise and devastating. "You couldn't hold on to the people who made you. What makes you think you can hold on to him?" Vesna's breath shuddered. The wound was old and deep, and it still bled when pressed. She felt the familiar rush of shame, the instinct to shrink, to fold inward, to take up less space. Then she stopped. She looked at the dark wolf with his stolen power and his calculated cruelty. She looked at the silver wolf pinned beneath his paw, barely alive, still fighting. And she thought of Odara, of the woman who had found a nameless baby sleeping between two dusty shelves and had chosen, without hesitation, to keep her. "My parents left me," Vesna said, and her voice shook, but it held. "I don't know why. Maybe I'll never know. And for 22 years, I believed it meant I wasn't worth keeping." She paused and took a breath that felt like swallowing fire. But Odara kept me. She chose me. She looked at a child with no name and no claim to anything and decided I was worth her time. And her love. And her life. She stepped forward. Drevnik's eyes narrowed. I was worth keeping all along, Vesna said. I was just the last person to know it. She turned from Drevnik and knelt beside the silver wolf. She placed her hand on his flank and felt the faintest pulse of warmth beneath the tarnished fur. And so are you, she whispered. You carry the guilt of Kareth Pass like it's a debt you owe the dead. You think you deserve this because people died under your command. But guilt is not justice, Jorvin. Letting this thing consume you doesn't bring anyone back. It just means the dead take one more life. The silver wolf's eye opened. Just one. Gray as iron. Gray as the sky before dawn. You are allowed to survive this, Vesna said, her voice breaking. You are allowed to put it down and live. Drevnik lunged. His jaws opened wide, aimed at Vesna's throat, and the force of his movement shook the ground like an earthquake. But the silver wolf moved first. It surged upward with a strength that shouldn't have been possible and caught Drevnik by the throat. The two wolves collided in a storm of shadow and silver, the ground splitting beneath them, the amber sky cracking apart. Vesna felt the bond ignite like a sun being born, pouring through the connection between her and Jorvin, flooding the silver wolf with everything she was, every stubborn, terrified, hopeful part of her that had spent a lifetime learning to survive being left behind. The silver wolf's jaws closed. Drevnik shattered. Not like breaking, like unraveling. The darkness peeled away in strips, dissolving like smoke in a strong wind. His amber eyes widened with genuine, shocked surprise. Then he was gone. The amber drained from the sky. The ground cracked and fell away, revealing something underneath. Green. New grass. Thin and fragile, pushing through the ruin like a promise. The silver wolf stood in the clearing, whole and bright, his fur gleaming like moonlight on fresh snow. He turned to Vesna. His gray eyes, Jorvin's eyes, held hers for a long, quiet moment. Then the fracture dissolved, and she was kneeling on the stone floor of his chambers with her hands on his face and tears streaming down both their cheeks. Jorvin's eyes were gray, just gray. No amber, no burning. Just the tired, beautiful human eyes of a man who had been lost for a very long time and had finally been found. You came back, he said, his voice raw and wrecked and wondering. I will always come back, Vesna replied. He pulled her against his chest and held her so tightly she could feel his heartbeat against her own, steady and strong and free. The power didn't vanish overnight. Jorvin still had surges in the weeks that followed. Smaller ones, manageable, like aftershocks from an earthquake that had finally passed. Some mornings he woke with his hands trembling, and Vesna would lace her fingers through his and hold on until the shaking stopped. The court had opinions about their bond. A foundling bookbinder and the Alpha King was not a pairing anyone had anticipated or particularly welcomed. The whispers followed Vesna through every corridor, and she felt the weight of every sideways glance, but Jorvin's hand was steady in hers when they stood before the court together. His voice was clear when he told them, in terms that left no room for interpretation, that Vesna was his mate and his choice, and that anyone who found that difficult to accept was welcome to take it up with him personally. Nobody took him up on it. Months later, Vesna woke slowly in the pale morning light filtering through the curtains. Jorvin was still asleep beside her, one arm draped across her waist, his breathing deep and even. No tremors, no surges, no amber burning behind closed eyelids, just a man, resting peacefully beside the person he loved. She watched him for a moment, warmth filling her chest like sunlight through glass. Then she settled back against his shoulder, closed her eyes, and slept.